During the Java Sea campaign, many stories of doomed ships and men came to pass. The desperate stand of the Allied forces against Imperial Japan was fertile ground for such stories. Ships like Perth or Exeter or Edsall became well known for their last stand. One of the best known of these ships is USS Houston, the Galloping Ghost of the Java coast, as she became known. Although I suppose an alternate title for this video could also have been FDR's favorite ship. Houston was the most powerful combatant the Allies could muster after the sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse. An old heavy cruiser that was only heavy in the sense that she carried 9 8-inch guns. This old ship was matched against a superior adversary, and that Houston held out as well as she did remains something of an inspirational story to this day. This doomed stand was, however, only a small part of her active career. Let's look at the rest of Houston's story first. The ship that would become USS Houston, CA-30, was laid down on May 1st, 1928. One of the Northampton class of cruisers, Houston was originally classified as a light cruiser. This was due to her relatively thin armor. During the 1920s, this was considered more important than the size of the guns when it came to designating a ship in the United States Navy. Although she wouldn't have that designation for very long. Houston launched, still considered a light cruiser, on September 7, 1929. Her commissioning followed on June 17, 1930. Within a year, however, USS Houston would change from CL-30 to CA-30, from a light cruiser to a heavy cruiser. This wasn't something the United States Navy thought up in this case. The London Naval Treaty of 1930 classified all ships with 8-inch guns as heavy cruisers. Armor protection, or lack thereof, no longer mattered, at least not under the new treaty system. This does make a good point to talk technical details, however. USS Houston displaced around 9,200 tons on her standard loading. This was well below the 10,000-ton Washington Treaty limit on cruisers. Even so, Houston remained one of the more capable treaty cruisers. She carried 9 8-inch 203mm guns and 3 triple turrets, 2 super-firing on the bow, and a single triple turret on the stern. To support those, the cruiser was also equipped with 4 5-inch 25 caliber anti-aircraft guns. Somewhat strangely for an American cruiser, Houston was also, initially, equipped with 6 21-inch torpedo tubes. These would be removed, however, by the time she saw actual combat. Regardless, this firepower would have been quite extensive for a light cruiser, until the London Naval Treaty put her in the heavy cruiser category. While still decently armed for that role, her armor protection suddenly became an issue. Part of her extreme weight savings came from cutting down, drastically, on armor protection. While not a tin can, by any means, the thickest armor on Houston was 3 3/4 of an inch, or 95mm, in thickness. For a light cruiser, this isn't bad. For a heavy cruiser, it's certainly on the lower end. In any event, all of this weaponry and armor could cut through the water at around 33 knots. This speed was provided by 107,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. With the technical details out of the way, Houston's story began in much the same way as many interwar American warships. She spent her shakedown cruise on a short jaunt to Europe from September through early October 1930. This saw her visit Britain, the Netherlands, and France in that order. Following this, she made a stopover in her namesake city on October 23rd through the 29th. Her time in the United States would prove short-lived, however. Houston was reassigned in January 1931 to the Asiatic Fleet based out of the Philippines. She arrived in Manila on February 22, 1931, whereupon she would become the flagship of the Asiatic Fleet. In this role, she replaced the old armored cruiser USS Pittsburgh. Quite a jump in capability for that fleet, even if Houston was still classed as a light cruiser at the time. Her initial service in the Asiatic Fleet matched up pretty well with other ships. Port visits to various locations in China to show the flag as much as anything else. Houston was somewhat special in that she was evidently the first American warship to welcome Chinese officers and cadets aboard. While noteworthy, to be sure, the rest of 1931 was spent sailing up and down the Chinese coast. She would occasionally trade flagship duty, most notably with the yacht Isabel, but nothing major occurred, aside from the change in designation to CA-30 on July 1, 1931. 1932, on the other hand, dawned with a bit of excitement. After a brief return to Manila in late January, Houston sailed back to Shanghai in February 1932 as relations between China and Japan worsened. Upon arrival, the cruiser put some of her crew ashore to help guard a power plant. These men were soon joined on February 8th by Houston's Marine Detachment. The Marines, however, were primarily used for training. Those Marines would remain in Shanghai until April 29th, joined by the sailors who had previously gone ashore. This left most of Houston's landing force training in China, which helped them, but it also gave the ship a chance to test her performance with a reduced crew. Fortunately for the cruiser, she wasn't called into action with that smaller crew. Relations between China and Japan were still frosty, but they didn't escalate further at that point. This allowed Houston to leave Shanghai behind on June 7, 1932. She remained in Chinese waters, however, until returning to Manila in January 1933. The cruiser spent early 1933 in the Philippine capital, only leaving in mid-March, at which point it was back to various port visits once again. It's a trend for Asiatic Fleet ships, which were largely a thing to show, yes, the United States is interested in this area. What was somewhat special in 1933 was a visit to Japan in June. At the time, the Japanese treated Houston's officers with respect and welcomed the visit. Relations between the two Pacific powers had not yet fallen as hard as they would later in the decade. More time in China would follow, until, in October 1933, Houston was finally sent back to the United States. While her initial time back home was spent on fleet maneuvers, Houston eventually found herself in New York on May 31, 1934. It was at that point that her story with President Franklin D. Roosevelt began. On July 1st, Roosevelt boarded the cruiser. The president would remain aboard as Houston made several port calls in the Caribbean before sailing through the Panama Canal and into the Pacific. Through all of this, the president seemingly quite enjoyed his time aboard the cruiser, to the point of going fishing on July 12th. More interestingly, the airship Macon would make an appearance on July 19, 1934. This was apparently quite impressive, as the massive airship descended out of a heavy rain cloud, with her planes flying about. Roosevelt was quite enamored with the entire situation, watching as Macon launched and recovered her parasite aircraft. In general, the president enjoyed his time aboard Houston, making a speech to the crew on July 21st, praising them and their ship quite enthusiastically. After a stopover in Hawaii, though, Houston sailed to Portland, Oregon, arriving on August 3rd. Roosevelt disembarked at this point after sailing aboard the cruiser for nearly 12,000 miles, all told. Considering the president's health, even in the early 1930s, that's quite a long time. And it would definitely not be his last cruise aboard USS Houston either. The remainder of 1934 and most of 1935 was a quieter time. A lot of training duty. Houston participated in Fleet Problem 16 as a notable example, alongside smaller exercises. This period of stereotypical interwar service ended in October 1936. From October 2nd through the 23rd, the cruiser carried President Roosevelt once again. This was much the same as the previous voyage, a series of port visits and a transit of the Panama Canal. This time from Pacific to Atlantic, as Houston ultimately disembarked the president in Charleston, South Carolina on October 23rd. Being used as an impromptu yacht for the president aside, Houston had a fairly quiet and mundane career for the rest of the 1930s. 1936 through 1937 saw more training duty, aside from a break to celebrate the opening of the Golden Gate Bridge in May 1937. 1938 saw another cruise with the president from July 16th through August 9th. Roosevelt would ultimately disembark in Pensacola, Florida on that day. This cruise is mostly notable for how it ended. When the president left the cruiser, he said, "Every moment of the trip has been delightful. I feel the Houston is home." In addition to making note of the fact that it was his third visit to the cruiser in only 4 years. You're probably beginning to see why an alternate title could easily have been FDR's favorite ship. In any event, Houston spent a stint as flagship of the United States fleet from September 19th through December 28th, 1938. After that ended, she returned to the scouting force, only to promptly take the president aboard again on January 4th, 1939. Yes, really. This time Roosevelt was aboard to observe Fleet Problem 20 in person during February of 1939. This ended up being the second to last of the interwar fleet problems as the world drew ever closer to war. Not that anyone aboard Houston knew that, as they hosted the president for what ended up being his last time aboard the cruiser. Upon the conclusion of the fleet problem, Houston set off for the Pacific. She would never again return to the Atlantic. A stint at Pearl Harbor from December 1939 through August 1940 followed, at the end of which Houston sailed for the West Coast. From August 30th through October 1940, Houston received a much-needed refit and overhaul at Mare Island. This largely consisted of improvements to her fire control systems and anti-aircraft weaponry. Specifically, the addition of 4 more 5-inch guns on top of her aircraft hangar. These were supported by 3 3-inch guns and a single quad 1.1-inch cannon mount. The 3-inch guns were intended to be replaced by further Chicago pianos, but there was a delay in procurement of those weapons. Regardless, once her refit was complete, Houston sailed to Pearl Harbor, but only temporarily. By November 3rd, she was leaving Hawaii for the wide reaches of the Pacific. The cruiser stopped over in Guam on November 13th, before leaving for the Philippines and the Asiatic Fleet. She arrived on November 19th, 1940. Houston once more took up flagship duties for the Asiatic Fleet, where she would remain for the rest of her career, aside from the very end of it, from November 1940 through December 1941. Unlike her previous time in the role, the now aging cruiser would not go on port visits across China. War with Japan was looking increasingly likely. While not at war, Houston and the rest of the Asiatic Fleet were certainly preparing for the eventuality. Training and other such duties took up most of her year in the Philippines, between arrival and war breaking out. A break in that routine came in November of 1941. Houston received a short refit, which saw her 3-inch guns finally replaced with the originally intended quad 1.1-inch mounts, bringing her total to 4 such mounts, or 16 barrels in all. By this point, it was abundantly clear that war was coming soon. Admiral Hart showed a remarkable foresight in dispersing his small and outdated fleet to preserve it in the event of attack. Houston, in particular, left Manila on December 1st. When war arrived on December 8th, December 7th on the Hawaii side of the dateline, Houston promptly sailed south. She joined the light cruiser USS Boise and several destroyers, escorting convoys to safer waters. There are two things I would like to note here. First, Boise was arguably a more effective combatant than Houston was at this point. A much more modern cruiser of the Brooklyn class, she carried no fewer than 15 6-inch guns, as well as, and this is very important, radar. Houston had been in the process of a refit to get her own radar set, but this would not come to pass as she was ordered to safer waters. Secondly, it was at this time that Houston was first reported sunk by the Japanese, despite never being attacked. It would become something of a running theme, really, as the Japanese constantly claimed they sank her when they hadn't. This is where the Galloping Ghost of the Java Coast nickname came about. It was at this point that USS Houston fell under direct command of Rear Admiral William Glassford. This man would prove to be less than popular with the crew. First, because of failing to engage in apparent enemy formation, although the veracity of this sighting is debatable, and then for being more of a political officer than a combat officer. Glassford's issues aside, Houston arrived in the East Indies on December 14, 1941. A further voyage saw her reach Java on the 17th, where Glassford would haul his flag down and move ashore. By this point, Prince of Wales and Repulse were on the bottom, and Houston was the most powerful Allied warship available. Although an argument again can be made that Boise was her superior by this point. That aside, the early days of the Second World War passed largely without incident from Houston's perspective. The cruiser patrolled and escorted convoys, including a stopover in Darwin for about a week, from January 5th through the 12th, 1942. When that was done, she returned to the Java Sea and continued on escort missions for the newly formed ABDACOM. That is the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command. A bit of a mouthful, and also a bit of a mess that never quite worked properly. In any case, it wouldn't be long until Houston saw her first combat. On February 4th, 1942, Houston was subjected to air attack. This action saw a hit to her No. 3 turret that completely disabled it, and that was damage that would never be repaired. For the rest of her career, Houston was down to 6 guns in her 2 bow turrets. Just as bad, from the perspective of Allied command, the antique, but still useful cruiser Marblehead was damaged. And she was damaged badly enough that she had to retreat home and leave the defense behind. Houston, down a turret or not, had to stick around. She returned to escort duty, now with a fresh supply of 5-inch ammunition, courtesy of USS Boise, which herself had to return home after running aground. This probably saved her in the long run, but it left Houston as the sole American cruiser in the area. With a classically Asiatic Fleet grit and determination, Houston's crew continued on. On February 15, 1942, the cruiser found herself escorting a convoy to Timor. This convoy was spotted by a Japanese flying boat, which, while eventually shot down, reported their location. The next day, the 16th, a swarm of Japanese G4M bombers attacked, along with some more flying boats. During the resulting action, Houston's captain, Albert Rooks, proved to be a fine ship handler. The cruiser wasn't hit even once, although the Japanese were very good with their aim. Houston's own aim was just as good, seeing 7 aircraft shot down. Unfortunately, the rapid pace of the Japanese invasion meant the entire endeavor was a waste of time. Timor would fall, and the convoy was sent back without ever reaching its destination. Houston was subjected to further air attacks for the rest of the month before she saw her first proper surface action. This came on February 27, 1942, and would prove to be less than successful. After all, this battle was the Battle of the Java Sea. A topic worth a dedicated video, so I'll focus on Houston's role here. During the Java Sea engagement, Houston would engage the Japanese heavy cruisers Nachi and Haguro. The fire from those ships was surprisingly ineffective, considering Japanese performance in this period, as well as the fact they fired, between them, something like 1,000 8-inch shells. Houston was only hit twice, one that passed clean through her without exploding, and another that did minimal damage and some minor flooding. The fire directed at the British cruiser Exeter did more damage, forcing that cruiser out of the line. A second phase to the battle, early on the 28th, saw a torpedo attack from the Japanese. This salvo of torpedoes sank the Dutch cruisers De Ruyter and Java, while Houston and the Australian cruiser Perth evaded damage. With Exeter crippled and attached to her own fate, that left Houston and Perth as the only Allied cruisers that could conceivably still fight. For a certain value of conceivably, with much of their ammunition expended, and Houston still down a turret. Regardless, they broke off from the Japanese and prepared to make a break for Australia and safety. Unfortunately, Houston and Perth would not find that safety. On the early morning hours of March 1st, 1942, the cruisers stumbled into a Japanese landing force as they attempted to flee the Java Sea. The Battle of Sunda Strait broke out, which would ultimately see both Allied ships sent to the bottom. They fought valiantly, even so. Perth tried to break through a formation of Japanese destroyers before being crippled and sent to the bottom. As for Houston, she fired every functional gun aboard, dueling the Japanese as long as she could. As shells ran out in her forward turrets, the cruiser continued to fight. Her crew hefted shells from the magazine of her disabled third turret, carrying them to her bow to continue firing. Through it all, the Japanese blasted Houston in turn. A shell hit her foremost quad 1.1-inch mount, with shrapnel from that impact killing Captain Rooks. The cruiser's executive officer, David Roberts, immediately took command and continued fighting the ship. It was only when Houston was sinking and unable to fight back that Roberts ordered abandon ship. As her crew took to the water, they watched the old Houston roll over on her side. Shell holes were blasted through one end of the ship and out the other. Her guns continued to point out at the enemy, even as they fell silent. With the roll steadily continuing, the men in the water described it as laying down to die. USS Houston, hit by as many as 4 torpedoes and over 30 shell hits, slipped beneath the waves. Unfortunately for her crew, their suffering had just begun. The Japanese destroyers circling the ruined cruiser were not Inazuma or Ikazuchi. The captain of these ships ordered the men in the water machine-gunned. The few survivors that were pulled from the water did not see a kind fate either. 368 of Houston's crew, 24 Marines included, survived. Of those men, 77 would die in captivity, with the rest suffering terribly before the war ended. A similar fate befell the survivors of HMAS Perth. As for the wrecks of the ships, well, Houston and Perth have both been subject to intensive illegal salvage. To my knowledge, Perth has suffered worse, but Houston has also been stripped pretty badly. Such is a common fate for shipwrecks in the Java Sea. Not deep enough to be safe, and well enough known to be found easily. I do not doubt that, if it hasn't already happened, the two cruisers will eventually be torn completely apart. A sad fate, by all accounts. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.